Imagine being at 39,000 feet and you suddenly lose both of your engines. Well, this is exactly what happened with an Air Canada flight in 1983. Let's uncover one of the most interesting stories in aviation. Hi guys, you've got Sarmat here. Welcome to Pilot Stories Episode 1. This is the story of Air Canada Flight 143. तो भाई बात है 1983 की, काफ़ी पुरानी बात. An Air Canada Boeing 767 was doing a flight from Montreal to Adelaide. So this was a brand new aircraft, so crew was still getting familiar with the functionalities of the aircraft. This is when they get a low fuel pressure warning. So before we get into the technicals of what a fuel pressure warning is, we'll need to understand how the fuel system actually works on the aircraft. So what happens is that there is this fuel pump that withdraws the fuel from the tanks and feeds it into the engine. So the low fuel pressure warning could mean two things. Either there is no fuel in the tanks, or either there is some kind of malfunctioning with the pump itself. There is another point to be noted here. A 767 has three fuel pumps. एक राइट साइड वाले विंग के अंदर, एक लेफ्ट साइड वाले विंग के अंदर और एक मिडल के अंदर. सो दिस फर्स्ट वार्निंग वाज कमिंग फ्रॉम द राइट साइड. सो दे वर स्टिल ट्रबल शूटिंग एंड गोइंग थ्रू द चेकलिस्ट कि भाई ब्रांड न्यू जहाज़ के अंदर ये इशू आ क्यों रहा है कि दे गेट अ सेकेंड वार्निंग. एंड दिस टाइम दिस वार्निंग वाज कमिंग फ्रॉम द लेफ्ट साइड इंजन. सो दैट मेंट कि राइट साइड वाले फ्यूल पंप के अंदर भी मसला है और लेफ्ट साइड वाले फ्यूल पंप के अंदर भी मसला है. लेकिन दैट वाज वेरी एबनॉर्मल बिकॉज दिस वाज अ ब्रांड न्यू बोइंग 767. At this point, the aircraft was still 700 miles from its destination. So crew ने decide किया कि अब इस aircraft के साथ continue करना destination के लिए safe नहीं रहेगा and they need to divert. So diversion में क्या होता है that they would go to a nearby airport, वहाँ पे land करेंगे, they'll have the problem sorted out और अगर the problem sorted out हो जाता है तो then they would continue to Edmonton. So the air traffic controller told them that the nearest airport was Winnipeg, that was 120 miles away. So कहाँ 700 माइल और कहाँ 120 miles. So it was a no-brainer. तो क्रू ने डिसाइड किया कि हम लोग विनीपेग के लिए डाइवर्ट कर. अभी वो लोग प्रिपरेशन कर ही रहे थे विनीपेग के लिए डाइवर्ट करने की कि दे वर फेस्ड विद अ थर्ड फ्यूल प्रेशर वार्निंग, दिस टाइम फ्रॉम द मिडल फ्यूल टैंक. एंड टू मेक द मैटर्स वर्स इट वॉज फॉलोड बाय अ शट डाउन ऑफ द लेफ्ट इंजन. नाउ द कैप्टन वॉज फाइनली श्योर दैट दे वर इन फैक्ट रनिंग आउट ऑफ फ्यूल बिकॉज एक फ्यूल पंप ख़राब हो सकता है, दो फ्यूल पंप ख़राब हो सकते हैं, लेकिन तीन फ्यूल पंप्स का एक साथ ख़राब होना वॉज आउट ऑफ द क्वेश्चन. And now they were only flying with one engine. So the captain told the first officer to run the checklist for a single engine landing. Now landing an aircraft with a single engine is not alien to pilots because in order to become an airline pilot you have to go through some really rigorous training, and landing an aircraft with a single engine is a part of that flight training process. But while they were running through their checklist for a single engine landing, they ran out of their second engine as well. Now pilots are trained to land with a single engine, but no one has ever been trained to land with no engines at all. The craft had merely turned into a glider and the pilot made a mayday call, which basically is the most critical call that a pilot can make and means that we are going down. Since both the engines had failed, the pilots were left with a very few options. अब होता क्या है when both the engines fail, तो एयरक्राफ्ट के अंडरकैरेज में से एक प्रोपेलर डिप्लॉय होता है दैट बेसिकली रोटेट्स, और उस रोटेशन एनर्जी से जो इलेक्ट्रिसिटी जनरेट होती है इट इज़ यूज्ड टू पावर सम क्रिटिकल हाइड्रोलिक्स विच आर यूज्ड टू स्टीयर द एयरक्राफ्ट एंड सम इलेक्ट्रिकल इंस्ट्रूमेंट्स. और इससे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम ये था दैट दे वर लूजिंग एल्टीट्यूड एट अ वेरी हाई रेट ऑफ डिसेंट, एंड विद दैट रेट ऑफ डिसेंट they would not be able to reach Winnipeg as well. In fact, they would crash 15 miles short of it. Not being able to fly to Winnipeg, they asked the air traffic controller if they had any other options available, and they were told that they could instead fly to Gimli, which was only 12 miles away. But the problem with Gimli was that it was not an international airport, which meant that it did not have the modern facilities available. But being out of options, they decided that they would now divert to Gimli. So the pilots initiated a turn towards Gimli, and 5 miles short of Gimli, they could see the runway straight. Now that the runway was in sight, it was a sense of relief for the pilots. But the challenges were far from over here. Normally when an aircraft comes into land, we have systems on board that help to slow down the aircraft, which mainly consist of flaps and slats. But in this case, they were simply flying too fast to land. So अगर तो आप एयरक्राफ्ट की विंडो सीट पे बैठे हो right next to the end of the wing, you would have seen that there are some control surfaces that extend from the wing. So what they do is that they help to generate more lift at slower speeds, so the aircraft can land safely. But since these had no power, they couldn't use these functions as well. Now they were dropping at a very high rate of descent and reaching the runway very fast. They had only one attempt to put the aircraft safely on the ground, or it could all end up in a tragedy. Only when an aircraft comes in to land at the runway, it would come and descend in straight and, as we know it, land on the runway. But in a slight slip maneuver, the pilot would turn the aircraft in a manner that it would use this fuselage in order to create some drag, and that would slow the aircraft down. Now this is something that Captain Bob Pearson had practiced during his early days of training as a glider pilot. Now he had experience of initiating this maneuver on smaller gliders, but they had no idea what would be the consequences of initiating this maneuver on a larger aircraft like a Boeing 767. Now the plan was that the captain would initiate a slight slip till they reached the runway, and upon landing he would straighten the aircraft and land back normally. And that is exactly what we did. But however, when they reached the runway, they realized that Gimli was not an airport anymore. In fact, it had been turned into a racing track. And when they were landing, the pilots could see two children running down the length of the runway. Thankfully, the children somehow ran to the sides of the runway and they avoided the aircraft. But upon landing, the front landing gear of the aircraft collapsed and caused the nose of the aircraft to drag alongside the runway. Now this was very important. Had the front landing gear of the aircraft not collapsed, this could all have ended up in a tragedy, because the aircraft was simply too fast. It would have run out of the runway and it could have all ended up in a calamity. But thankfully, after 17 minutes of nightmare, everybody on board was safe and sound on ground, and now the investigation was to begin. Later on, the investigators found out that there was in fact no fuel on aircraft when it landed. In order to fuel the 767, the technicians had to do a small math conversion, which required them to convert volume into weight. Now, in order to fuel the aircraft, they were required to convert volume units to kgs, but instead the technicians converted from volume units to pounds, and since pound is only half the value of kg, the aircraft was only filled with half the fuel. And somehow this has gone unnoticed from pilots as well. This is how a whole airliner was brought down by a simple maths mistake. We'll wrap our first episode of Pirate Stories here. Like, subscribe and share. Till we meet the next time.